Okay, so Rod talked about a need for coaches and umpires, but I want you to know that we also have need for assistant coaches, for people to work on the grounds, for people to work in concession and all of that. And like Rod said, you don't have to be an expert in baseball. We're working with kids here. They don't know much about baseball either, okay? So we can cover for you. We'll make you look like an expert. And it really is a fabulous ministry. And again, as Rod said, there's some sacrifice of time involved. But the good thing about this ministry, it ends in June and July. And so it's a short-term commitment. And if you don't have time for that, then maybe you can come on Saturday from 9 to 12 as we get the fields ready. We were going to do that last week, you remember? We had to postpone that because of sogginess, okay? And so we're going to try it again this Saturday, 9 to 12. By the way, my name is Jeff. I'm one of the pastors here at Graceway. If you're our guest this morning, we are glad to have you. And I'm going to ask all of us if we would take our Bibles and find the Gospel of Luke. Luke chapter 6. We're going to start in verse 46 in just a second. And speaking of sogginess and strange weather, how's your foundation doing? Isn't that a horrible question? Man, I'm scared to death. We've been through a year of drought, and then all of a sudden we get 2 major snowstorms in just a few days, and then followed up by this weekend with a lot of rain and stuff like that. And those of us who live in this part of the country, we know that foundations are a pretty big deal. And so I'm asking you, how's your foundation? Maybe I should get back with you in a month or so, and I'll ask that same question. And probably by that time, maybe you'll know, and I hope that everything is okay both for you and for me. I don't know about you, but I was having trouble opening a few doors with all the snow on the roof. Do you ever have something like that happen? I was up trying to get snow off my roof, and we don't have a flat roof. I mean, it's just kind of one of those strange years. Now, believe it or not, that's exactly what Jesus is talking about. And that's the text that we want to look at this morning in verse 46, Luke chapter 6 and verse 46. We're coming to the very end of what we've called the Sermon on the Plain. Jesus came down from a mountain to begin this teaching. There's a similar story in the Gospel of Matthew that we call the Sermon on the Mount. Very similar content, very similar approach, but it's different time, different setting. And that's in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. But let's look in verse 46. And why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? Whosoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, I will show you to whom he is like. He's like a man which built a house and digged deep and laid the foundation on a rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently upon that house and could not shake it, for it was founded upon a rock. But he that hears and does not is like a man that without a foundation built a house upon the earth, against which the stream did beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. Now, this sermon that Jesus is preaching here began earlier in chapter 6. In fact, beginning in verse 17, you see the multitudes coming together to hear Jesus and to be healed. And then in verse 20, Jesus begins to speak. And as he speaks, he's explaining to them what it means to follow him, what it means to be his disciple, the type of life that is expected of them. And it's very interesting. It ends here in these last verses of Luke chapter 6 with Jesus drawing a line through this multitude of people who's come to hear him. Everybody was welcome to come and hear. But now Jesus has explained what it means to be his disciple, what it costs to follow him. And now he says, so, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and you're not willing to do what I say? Well, what he just did, he just divided the group into 2. Those who do and those who don't. That's how he's bringing this to a close. In other words, here's the issue. Jesus is trying to answer the question, what does it mean to say that Jesus is Lord. You've all seen that on bumper stickers, right? Or you've seen that on a billboard, or you've seen some guy hold up a sign in a sports event or a parade or something like that. And that's fine, but what does that really mean? Jesus is Lord. Well, you know what? Jesus was Lord before any of us recognized that. The question is, what does it mean in my life? What does it mean for me to say that He is my Lord? And this morning, I'm going to give you a 4-letter word. Yeah, hope no kids are here. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to give you a 4-letter word that Christians absolutely hate. We despise this word. We hate it. We avoid it at all cost. But this 4-letter word, I think, is one of the major reasons why many people do not build their lives upon a solid foundation. So we're going to talk about that later. I'll tell you what it is in a little bit. And for the meanwhile, you can just kind of imagine, you can kind of think about that. What 4-letter word would that be? I will not cuss, although when you hear what it is, you may wish that I would. Or you may cuss. Okay, that's okay. But we're going to talk about that a little bit later. What is the foundation of our lives? Now, biblical symbolism is pretty clear. Jesus Christ is the rock. Okay, we ought to build upon Him, but it's not building good works on Him. It is our transformed life, transformed by His grace, applied through our faith. That's the whole point. Do we have a transformed nature? It's not working hard to get something, but revealing either we are or we're not. That was the whole point of what we saw last week, verses 43 to 45, about the good tree and the bad tree. And how do you know a good tree from a bad tree? Good fruit versus bad fruit. That's the whole point. Are you a good tree or are you a bad tree? Have you put your faith in Jesus or have you not? In other words, you've heard Jesus talk about what it means to follow Him, so what are you going to do about it? We are redeemed by the grace of God, or we're not. And as I pointed out last week, as we go through the teaching of Jesus in the New Testament, He never presents middle ground. It's always an either or. You're His follower, or you're not. You've been redeemed by His grace, or you haven't. You're His disciple, or you're not. There's no middle ground. So how can I be the good person that Jesus is talking about here when He talks about good trees and bad trees? And we saw last week, just to review a little bit, we jumped ahead a few chapters in Luke, and we saw a very wealthy, influential young man come to Jesus to say, so good master, what one thing do I lack in order to get into the kingdom of God, in order to get into heaven, we might say? Now, he was a very religious young man, very devout. He was good at following the rituals and the ceremony of the Jewish people and whatnot. And it's interesting that Jesus answered his question with a question and said, whoa, you called me good master, right? Why did you call me good master? There is only one good, and that is God. That's the issue. Who is Jesus? It's not what have you or I done, or what haven't we done. The issue is, who is He? He's God or He's not. Again, there's no middle ground. Just kind of sort of part of, no, he is or He isn't. You called me good. Why did you do that? And went right over this young man's head. Had no clue what Jesus was trying to communicate to him. Jesus gave him a 1-question exam. He flunked. And so he begins to talk to Jesus and said, well, good master, I've kept all the commandments from my youth up. I mean, all my life. I've been a good churchgoer, God-fearing, Bible-believing type person, and I've served on this committee and that committee. All the rules I've kept and all of this. I'm sure that what he was expecting is for Jesus to say something like, you're just the type of guy we're looking for in heaven. Come on. But he didn't get that. Instead, he got a question. Why do you call me good? There's only one good, that's God. That's the issue. And when Jesus saw that he didn't get it, he pushed his hot button. He wasn't giving him a plan of salvation. He said, okay, you want to talk about keeping rules? Then go sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Whoops. He went away sorrowful because, you see, he was very wealthy. That was his area where he had chosen to hold it close to his vest. Jesus exposed who he was. So there's the issue. There is only one way to true goodness, and that is through the grace of God. That's why, as we saw last week, Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5:17, if anyone be in Christ, he's a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. Paul is speaking not of us working hard to improve and do better. Paul says, no, what we need is to be transformed by the grace of God. He makes us into something entirely new and different. So in Luke 6 and verse 46, where we started this morning, where Jesus said, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do the things which I say? Here's the knee-jerk reaction that a lot of times people have, kind of like the rich young ruler. We're still in that same mode of thought. So I got to work. Okay, let me go through the New Testament. I'll find all the things Jesus said. I'll make a checklist. I'll start doing them and checking them off. Wait just a second. That's exactly what the rich young ruler was trying to do. And what happens if you don't get them all? What happens if you don't see one? What happens if you're not doing so good on one? Well, I'll make this list. I'll start checking them off. Wrong response, and that's not what Jesus is saying here. This is not our natural way of thinking. We want to do something. What must I do to get to heaven? What must I do to be saved? Well, it's not a matter, as in the case of the rich young ruler, making up a list of rules and all that type of stuff. You remember last week when Jesus talked about you hypocrite, and I explained to you what the word hypocrite meant in the first century? It wasn't nearly as harsh as it is today. It meant someone whose words and actions did not match, and it was often used to speak of actors in a Greek or Roman drama, which, according to the custom of the day, many of them would use a mask. And so they would be behind the mask acting out a character that was not necessarily what was going on in their own life. It was just a portrayal. And what you and I do, even to this day, we may not have a physical mask, but we still have masks that we hide behind. We've got a church-going mask. We've got a church leader mask. We've got a pastor mask. We've got a good person mask. We've got all these masks that we wear, but yet our words and actions don't necessarily line up. Now, here's the problem with the rules and saying, okay, well, I'm just going to go find everything that Jesus said and I'll do it, then I'll be okay. Here's the problem. Many of us think that just because we are willing to apply biblical truth to problems when we think that we need it. I got a problem, so I'll go see what the Bible has to say and I'll apply that to my life. That doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus is our Lord. Because of one word, one four-letter word. Here it comes. Okay, you ready for this? Here's the word: obey. We hate that word. Sometimes when I try to explain it to people, they say it makes them feel kind of weird. In fact, let me just show you, okay? I'm coming down here, Mark, to pick on you. I always pick on you because you always sit right here, okay? I'm sorry. You don't want me to pick on you? Go sit somewhere else. Okay, Mark, would you take this pen and hold it for just a second? Thank you, Mark. Would you give it back to me, Mark? Thank you for obeying me, Mark.
You're a good man.
So how did that make you feel?
Oh, very good.
Made you feel good?
Yes.
Okay, sometimes people say, yeah, well, it made me feel kind of good, but it made me feel kind of like a little kid. Like Daddy was saying, that's a good boy, little Mark. Thank you. You obeyed me. That's really cool. And, you know, we got that when we were kids, and we had that drilled into our head, and especially those of us who come from Western society, we just chaff at that because we are so stinking individualistic that when we start talking about obey, wow. Now, here's the problem. I can give you a list of 7 simple steps to follow Jesus, and you can go out this week and do them all. And you can say, yep, I believe the Bible, and I love to apply biblical truth to my life, and you can do all that and still not have Jesus as Lord of your life. Because what happens many times is we choose when we want to apply biblical truth and when we don't. And that's the problem. And the issue is then we are in control and not him. So building our life on a solid foundation is an issue of lordship. Why do you call me Lord, Lord? And the word is used twice for emphasis in the Aramaic language that Jesus is speaking here. The word Lord, kurios, in Greek, as Luke records this in the Greek language for us today, it's a title of respect for someone. And not necessarily religious in nature, although it can be, obviously. But for example, it was something that you would call your boss. It's something that a soldier would call his officer. It's something that you would use in a setting anytime you were in a position of subservience or submission to another person in a chain of command. You would call them Lord. Para ustedes que hablan español, you that are Spanish speakers, we have a word that historically is very similar in its use, and that word is patrón. Okay, patron, which would be used, let's say, of a guy who owns a plantation. Might be a coffee plantation, a sugar plantation, and he has many people who live on his plantation and work for him. And very much in the same system as in the South many, many years ago, you have people who are living there who are not just employees, they are what we might call sometimes indentured servants, where they really don't have any other place to go. They don't make enough money to have a lot of other choices, and so they're there, and there's the boss man, there's the patron, and so they submit to him. They treat him with great respect, at least to his face, because everything depends upon it. It's like saying, boss. Okay, boss. So these multitudes now have flocked to Jesus. And Jesus says, so why do you call me Lord, Lord, and yet you don't obey me? That's the issue. The issue is who is boss? Who's in control of your life? Him? You. That's Jesus' point. Okay, let's put this in the 21st century, okay? You got a job, praise God for that, okay? You go to work tomorrow, the boss says, okay, Mary, I want you to make these 5 calls. Whatever you do, make these 5 calls. Okay. So you sit down at your desk, and after a while you think, no, I don't think I will. And you don't. Maybe you want a few more days to think about it or whatever. Maybe you just don't think it's that important, and you don't. So what's that all about? What does that mean? Well, it probably means that sooner rather than later you'll be on the job market looking for a job. I mean, that's just the way that it is. It's not an insult to your personhood. It's just that when you get hired to do a job, you're hired to do a job. You're supposed to, listen, here's the word, you're supposed to obey what you're told to do. Now, even in the workplace, we try to avoid using that because people seem to think that's demeaning. So we talk about being a partner and an associate and all this type of stuff, which is another way of saying, I work for this company, okay? And even though they don't control my life, the salary that I get rents my attitude every week. It rents my obedience because they hire me to do a job. I'm supposed to do the job. Now, if we can figure that out, to obey an earthly boss, and we understand the consequences of not, here's the issue. Why can we not treat God Almighty with at least equal respect? And the truth is, I believe that very few people who are in church this morning in the United States even understand what I'm talking about. What does it mean for Jesus to be Lord of our life? Really, what does that mean? It means we obey him. We obey him. No, it doesn't mean legalism. No, I'm not talking about that. No, it's not how you get saved. No, it has nothing to do with that. It just means, why do you call Jesus Lord and not do what he says? building blocks of a solid foundation from this passage. I think if we could summarize what we're seeing here, there's a principle that emerges. God's truth plus obedience equals a rock-solid foundation. And this theme permeates so much of what Jesus is saying. Jesus is speaking God's truth, which often goes directly against what we've always thought or heard or said, goes against conventional wisdom. But would you notice in verse 47, there's an amazing summation here of what it means to follow Jesus. Whosoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, I'll show you to whom he is like. And then he's going to go into this little parable of the foundations. But I want you to notice the three verbs that Jesus uses. You come, you hear, and you do. It's a pretty good summary of what it means to follow Jesus. You come to Jesus, you put your faith in him. Because of what you do, because you work hard, because you dig down deeper? No. The Bible's very clear. Salvation is by grace through faith. It's because of what Jesus Christ did on the cross and his death and his resurrection that we'll be celebrating just a couple of weeks from now. We don't do something to get something. God doesn't operate that way. We come to him by faith. But then what's the next phase? Listen to him. Where do we do that? Right here. That's why the Bible is the subject matter every time the church assembles. We want to learn the Bible. Would you last very long at work if you told your boss, and because you got reprimanded, maybe they wrote you up or something like that, and you say, well, boss, you've got to give me a chance here, because the fact of the matter is I never listen to what you have to say. So if you're really serious about me doing something, you're going to have to either spell it out, or you're going to have to, come down and sit with me face to face and make sure that I really hear you, because, I never pay attention to what you have to say. But I'm really good at my job. You're probably going to be looking for another one. You're probably going to spend the next few months on unemployment. We'd never do that, but we do it to God all the time. Oh, yeah. Go to heaven? Sure. Hey, thanks, Jesus. Okay, I'll check you later. Check you in eternity, all right? I'll get back with you if I have a problem along the way. That's the issue. That's the problem. Come, hear, do. Obey. That's what that means. Obey him. Do what he tells us to do. And here's where we get confused, because every time human beings get together, churches no exception, we develop our own cultures, our own traditions, our own customs, and that's cool. And sometimes they're necessary for life, to be organized, to get along, to function. But the problem arises in the confusion when we elevate some of those customs and preferences and stuff like that to the level of foundation, biblical truth. I might say, I think everybody that is a male and comes to Graceway needs to wear a red tie on Sunday morning. Now, that would be pretty insane. But I promise you, those of us who are preachers, we're really good at finding 20 obscure verses in the Bible, stitching them together in such a way that we can make a case for it. Okay? Really. That's what sometimes we do. And so, you're a nice, pliable type person, and some of you, will show up next week, you got on a red tie, and some of you are like, ain't wearing your red tie. So then that's where the confusion comes in. Well, you've got to obey. We're the church, I'm the pastor, you have to obey. And then we get into all these standoffs and conflicts and stuff like that, when really we're not even talking about doing what Jesus said. And Jesus didn't say, why don't you do the stuff that Jeff says? He said, why don't you do the stuff that I say? And that's the issue. That's the only issue. It's not what I say. It's not what the church says. It's not, well, I've got this view on biblical prophecy, or I've got this view on dating, or I have this view on this or that. No, the issue is, what does the Bible say? Let me just give you an example, okay? Last Sunday we had some baptisms. We do that every first Sunday. Be baptized. I didn't say that. Jesus did. To him it was a big deal. When he gave the final instructions to his disciples that he said, that we sometimes call the Great Commission, he said, I want you to go to every ethnic group with this good news. I want you to make disciples of every ethnic group. I want you to baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And I want you to teach them to observe, to obey, literally what that means, everything that I've said. That sounds very familiar. Now here's the deal. This church doesn't ask you, we don't make you get baptized. You don't want to get, fine, you can sit here for the rest of your life. Jesus asks you to be baptized. Not me, not the church, Jesus does. So, back to Jesus' question. How can you call him Lord, Lord, and not do what he says? You answer that. I'm not mad, I'm not judging, I'm just saying, hey, this is what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is saying, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and you won't obey me? Well, I've got these feelings and I thought, and yeah, okay, Mary, make the 5 calls. Would you just make the 5 calls, Mary? Well, no, because I need more time to think about it, and I'm just not sure that really lines up with what I feel good about. Mary, would you just make the 5 calls? And Jesus said, why don't you get baptized? Now we can talk about mode of baptism and do we do it forwards or backwards, and do we do it in a tank or we do it in a river? No, he didn't even enter into that. He said, I want you to be baptized. Period. So how can we call him Lord, Lord and not obey him? Forgive. That was a big deal to Jesus. He talks about it all the time, to forgive each other. So how can we carry grudges and harbor hurts and hang on to all this stuff and say that Jesus is Lord? I would hope the answer would be obvious. We can't do that. How can we not have any interest in serving and making disciples of the nations of the world? And that doesn't mean that you have to sell your house and move to Afghanistan to be a missionary. I'm not talking about that. But if we're not concerned about making disciples of the people groups of this world, the ethnicities of this world, if we're not concerned about making disciples right here when that's what Jesus told us to do, you guys are always talking about making disciples. Yeah, but we didn't start it, Jesus did. He said, that's your main job. That's like being a firefighter and saying, no, my job is to do the barbecue. I don't fight fires, that's too dangerous. Well, you may be the best barbecuer in the firehouse. You may be the guy that's responsible to polish the proverbial pole. But the bottom line is, if you're a firefighter, your job's to put out fires. Right? Probably not going to remain on the force very long if you refuse stubbornly to do that. Nope, not getting on the truck. Nope, I decided I'm not going to fight fires today. I'm a little down. Just a little depressed, and I just need some personal time to, get over in a corner and just think about it for a while, whether I want to fight fires today or not. Nah, you won't last very long. But yet when Jesus said, I want you to go and make disciples of all nations, he says that all the time. No, I'm not really interested. I just care about what I can get out of it. Are you catching the drift? Giving, stuff like that? Okay, how can we say that he is Lord, Lord, and we don't give a rip about giving, about making disciples, about forgiving, about being baptized? And those are just a few examples. And the point that I'm trying to make is this. We could visit a church in Cairo, Egypt today, and you would be totally out of your element. We could visit a church in Jos, Nigeria today, and you would be absolutely blown away. Much of what you saw you would not even recognize, because there are different cultures, different languages, different customs, different cultures. But let me tell you what would be the same. This stuff that Jesus says, what Jesus says to do, it is the same for any culture, any language, any place, at any time, because Jesus said it. Okay, am I making sense? This is what this is all about. You could have a totally different tradition. You could have a different type of service. Some churches have got choir lofts and choirs. We don't. We got a praise team. Some churches have got organs. We don't. Are you with me? And maybe you like it. Maybe you don't. But when it comes down to making disciples, being baptized, forgiving, giving, all that basic stuff that we're talking about, that's not a matter of church culture. That's a matter of Jesus said to do this stuff. So how can we call him Lord, Lord, and not do that stuff? Now, once we understand this and we begin to obey him, then what we're doing is we're building a foundation on the rock. And then we can say, okay, life, bring it on, because I'm ready. I'm ready for the storms of life. And would you look in verse 48, he's like a man which built a house and digged deep and laid the foundation on a rock. And when the flood arose, the word is when, not if. Storms will come. Being a follower of Jesus does not exempt you from storms and floods. It just means that you've got a foundation to withstand the storms. Anybody, when we had those two storms with, foot of snow or so much in each of them, did anybody that lives in the metro area, did your neighbor get a foot of snow and you didn't because you're a believer in Jesus? If that happened to you, would you post that on Facebook? I'd really like to see that. I really would be interested. Of course not. Storms happen to all of us alike. That's why Jesus is using this example. The difference is the foundation. And the problem is, the biblical context here, we often dismiss this as something little children sing about in Sunday school. The wise man built his house upon the rock and all that type of stuff. And we ought to sing that next week, Jeremy. I'm just saying, okay. It's a great song, but the problem is when we think of this as a children's song, it sort of strips it of its power. I want you to consider something. This is the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Plain. This is the climax. He has reached the climatic moment, and this is what he says. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, it's exactly the same. The climatic moment, pow, he comes back with the foundation thing. Why? I'm going to try to answer that question next week. We're just kind of looking at the surface today. We're going to come back next week. We're going to dig. He talks about digging. We're going to come back next week. We're going to dig some. I believe, personally, this is probably one of the most explosive, emotional, religious, spiritual, political statements that Jesus ever made on this earth. And most of us who grew up here don't understand it because we don't understand the context. We don't understand what people are hearing when Jesus speaks these words. And we're going to look at that next week. I think you'll be amazed. You've heard me talk about parallelism a lot. We've talked about chiastic parallelism and step parallelism. And this is step parallelism that is being used here to tell this parable. And you don't have to understand anything about literature and structure. I don't expect you to. But the point is, I've explained to you that in chiastic parallelism, it's to make sure that everybody understands what the point of climax is, which is usually right in the center. When step parallelism is used, then what that means is the point of emphasis is at the end. And so in this particular case, what Jesus is saying, if you're a literary freak, I'll try to put that up on my blog tonight, but if you're someone who is listening to him and from this culture, you understand that the main issue here is the storm and its effect on these two houses. And the difference is the foundation. That's what it's all about. In Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, better known of the two versions, the issue is a wise man and a foolish man. And here the issue is, listen to this very carefully, foundation versus no foundation. Now I'm going to repeat that because some of you are going to miss this. I didn't say good foundation, bad foundation. That's not the point. The point here is foundation, no foundation. And when you get that, suddenly it changes your perspective a little bit. Look what it says here. Verse 49, but he that hears and does not is like a man that without a foundation built a house upon the earth, against which the stream did beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. No foundation. Nada, zero, nilch, not there. No foundation. Let me explain a little bit about the cultural context. Building a house today in our culture, hard work. A lot of you work in the building industry, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. You earn your pay. You go out, you work hard, you're out in the weather all day long, all that type of stuff. Sometimes you mash your hands or get cut. It's not easy. But building a house today is really no comparison to what people had to do in the first century in Palestine. Today, we bring in a backhoe, digs a hole, digs the foundation, truck shows up, pours concrete. Later, concrete blocks are lowered onto the foundation with power equipment and all of that. And it's a hard job, but wow, we've kind of got it down. But in biblical times, building a house on a solid foundation was incredibly hard. And because of that, when Jesus is speaking these words, everyone who is listening to him, they get it. Because they've seen it, some of them have experienced it. And here's the deal. And an early Christian writer, like not far removed from Jesus, was writing a commentary on this parable. Here's an excerpt from what he said. Every Christian knows that building a house is not an easy endeavor. Rather, it involves exhausting and frightening efforts, strenuous hardships, along with continuous and life-threatening struggles. And people who lived in those times would say, yeah, right on. You're absolutely right. Let me lay it out for you. In Israel, Palestine, in the first century, villagers would only build during the summer months, and that's because the winter was the rainy season. And so, and sometimes in Israel, there's even snow. Did you know that? I mean, it's kind of like Atlanta. You don't get a lot, but every now and then it snows. And so summer is better to build, but there's a problem that comes with summer too. The problem is the soil in that part of the world is extremely high in clay content. And so under the summer sun, it becomes like rock. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, it even talks about that. God speaks of that land, and he says, wow, sometimes it is like brass. And it really is. So understanding that, a lazy builder or a builder without much foresight or wisdom might imagine that he can cut corners. Because after all, you remember when we started Luke and I showed you what a typical house was like in that part of the world in the first century and even many places to this day? A simple one-story, maybe split level, but one story with maybe 2 rooms. Walls no more than 7 foot high at the highest. And so you're going to build a house. You just got married and you've taken some of the money from your dowry and from your parents and you're going to build your house. And so you're looking at this hard clay, man, and it is just like a rock. And to dig through that without power equipment like we have today, you're talking a pretty amazing struggle. Now, you know that the rock is right there beneath the clay, and it is all over this region of the world. And so you know, this is not going anywhere. I'm not going to put a lot of weight. I mean, this is just a small house, couple of rooms, 7-foot walls, so I'm just going to build it right here, and it will be fine. And so I build my house. It's got an adequate overhang for the water to run off. That's going to keep things dry. Everything is cool. And you know what? Most years, that's okay. But sometimes a year comes along like what we've just had. And it's not like normal. And all of a sudden it begins to rain. And rain. More rain than people can remember having had for years. And some of you who have grown up in Africa or Latin America, I've been there, you know what I'm talking about. This scene is going to sound very familiar to you. Some of you have grown up in the Middle East. You're going to get this. So you just put the house, a little simple house, right there on that hard clay ground, just like rock, and it's fine. But all of a sudden, it begins to rain and rain and rain. And you look out your front door and you begin to see, because the streets are not paved. And so pretty soon, you've got this little runoff river that's snaking its way down the street in front of your house. You know, oh man, that doesn't look good. And then after a few days, that hard clay takes on the consistency of chocolate pudding. And pretty soon that moisture begins to work its way underground, underneath where your house is sitting. And it begins to settle. And all of a sudden, a stone or a brick pops out of a wall of your house. And you're thinking, oh wow, that's your sign to evacuate now. Because within a very short period of time, there's going to be a big bulge in that wall, and then all of a sudden, it's going to totally collapse, and when it does, the entire house collapses. Everybody listening to Jesus knows that drill. They've all seen that. In the first century, Middle Easterners built with mud for mortar, and if a wall is not built directly on rock, it is only secure as long as the ground under it remains dry and prevents settling. Now, again, solid rock's everywhere. It may be 10 inches below the clay, it may be 10 foot below the clay, but you can dig down, you will find the bedrock, and responsible builders do that. August 28th, 1991. In a suburb of Jerusalem, 1/3 of a large apartment complex collapsed. 28 families lost their homes. Reports said it looked like a major earthquake. They investigated what was the problem. The problem was they determined that the builders had built that apartment complex on loose soil and not on the bedrock that is code. Some of you, unfortunately, I think this spring are probably going to find some cracks in your foundation. And sometimes it's just the way that it happens. Sometimes it could be that a builder cut some corners. I know that's hard to believe that somebody would do that in Kansas City in the 21st century. But sometimes a builder may not have been as responsible as he or she needed to be and may have cut some corners, and because of that, you're calling in the guys that do the foundation repair and paying them $20,000 or $30,000 to come and jack up your house. That's what's going on here. And that's what this is about. The rock foundation, the person, the words of Jesus. We put our trust in him. Our lives are transformed. We're building on that foundation. Hearing and doing his words are compared to the energy of digging through hard clay to get to the rock, complete with risk and danger and extreme effort. Now, that's not working to get saved. You understand me? This is not legalism. This is not working to get saved. This is not doing something to get something. Jesus is just simply saying, look, you come to me, hear my words, and then I expect you to obey. We want to make that an option. Jesus doesn't do well with options. He doesn't leave middle ground. You say, well, learn the Bible? Obey it? That'd be hard. Yeah, it's kind of like building your life on a solid foundation. Or you just go out and throw some stuff down on the ground, and it'll work for a while. But then what happens is you become one of those MacGyver Christians. Okay? Your life begins to fall apart, and you spend the rest of your life reacting, and piecing together your life with duct tape and Gorilla Glue. That's not a lot of fun. It's a lot better to build your life on the rock and know that it will withstand the storms and the flood. And that's the whole point. The storms and flood hit both houses. Being a follower of Jesus doesn't give you some magical protection from the trials and dangers of life. It means that if you're building your life on the rock, you will withstand the flood. You will withstand the storm. Do you have that solid foundation? Do you know him? Do you really know him? As always, if you have any question about your relationship to God, there's a contact card in the back of your seat there. If you take 30 seconds to fill that out with your contact info, circle the C that you'd like for somebody to contact you. Just give it to somebody in the counter out there. It happens all the time. Nobody's going to think you're weird or strange or make a big deal out of it. We'll just get a hold of you and say, hey, look, let's talk. What can we do? And the next step, are you willing to obey him? You're willing to forgive, to love, to be baptized, to do exactly what he says. Not me, the church. Not obey me, not obey the church, obey him. What does that look like for you? Let's stand together and pray, okay?